NYU-Poly Game Innovation Lab and Babycastles present engines, frameworks, and the means of production. Featuring Ivan Safrin and hosted by Andy Nealen.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy Nealen. I'm a professor here at NYU-Poly. I teach graphics and games, and I host the series. I got roped into this before I got the job, so I always kind of attribute that somewhat to that, but whatever. Going off the deep end here. Our speaker tonight, I should probably say like the next person who's coming here is Cindy. Catherine will be hosting that because I'm not in town for that. So yeah, it's gonna be great. Wow, so this just got loud. Okay, wow, wonderful. So our speaker tonight is Ivan Safrin. Ivan, known Ivan for about 3 years now. Ivan is a genius programmer and the creator of Polycode, which is an API for creative coding, which not too many of you are familiar with, I assume, because he doesn't actively advertise for it yet. He also creates a bunch of very, very interesting installations that often use large projectors and projection screens and not planar surfaces. So I don't know how much he's going to talk about that tonight. I'm just going to hand it over to him now, and after that I'll have a conversation with him, and then I'll go into audience Q&A. So without further ado, please welcome Ivan Safrin.
Hello. I don't give talks very often, so forgive me if this is a little disjointed. This was the original title of this talk, but it's not going to be all that as exciting as this typeface makes it look. But I am going to talk about frameworks and engines, and mostly my reasons for making my own. The past few years have been characterized by a lot of, well, they call it like the democratization of tools in the game development scene. There's Unity, there's UDK, there's all sorts of, there's processing and open frameworks and all kinds of stuff. So I wanted to talk about why I decided to make my own framework instead of using other people's frameworks. A lot of it, I think, to explain to myself as well and give myself reasons for keeping going with this completely insane task. I'm just going to like split it into two, and the first part talk about kind of what I think good tools should be and kind of explain the way that I've been using them ever since I started programming, and then just kind of show you Polycode, and hopefully these two parts will inform each other. There will be kind of a jump. All right, so I grew up in Russia, and my first computer was this thing, the Sinclair Spectrum. If you're not familiar with it, this was pretty popular in the UK in the early 80s. Not so much here. I don't know if it was popular in the rest of Europe, but it was like a big UK thing. And in Russia, everything arrived about like 5 to 10 years later, so I'm not that old, but this was my first computer. And it wasn't actually a real ZX Spectrum. Mine looked kind of like this. It was built by a friend of my parents for me I have no idea where they got the parts or how they cobbled it together. It actually looked uglier than this. It had this huge heat sink in the back, and it just overheated like every 5 hours. But it was kind of an amazing machine, and I want to talk about like why it was so great. It was like a home computer, but it's primarily used for playing games, and it had like it was ugly as sin. It had like what I guess 8 colors. They were all like really jarring primary colors. This is like a really good example of color usage. There's much uglier stuff out there. But aside from games, it had something else. It had a basic interpreter, and this is how I learned how to code when I was maybe like 10 or 11 years old. It was really fun to do. Like the way you did graphics, you had to draw. I got this from Google image search, so I guess this is someone trying to do Street Fighter graphics this way. But you drew 8 by 8 squares on graph paper, and you filled in each square, and then you added up, like you numbered each column, like 2, 4, 8, 16, up to 256, and then you added them up, and you got a number. And then you put in the sequence of those numbers, and you got sprites on the screen. And it was like this really hands-on way of doing stuff, and it was really simple. I mean, when I was like 11 years old, I had no idea what any of it did. Like now, looking back at it, like I was writing data into memory, overwriting existing characters with my own pixels, and at what's happening. But like when I was a kid, you drew this thing on a piece of paper, and then like put in these numbers, and just like magically, you had graphics on the screen, and you transferred them from paper into the computer, and it was amazing. And it was really amazing and really simple to do. And the reason I want to kind of start with that is that for me, the Spectrum was kind of the ultimate indie making tool, because it started, like, it had all the tools you needed to make games built into it. Like, if you looked at the actual hardware, it had commands printed on the keys themselves. Like, so you didn't have to type all the commands. You could just, there was a mode where you could just press a key and it would just type out the entire command. So the hardware was actually built for development. So it was basically a game console. Most people used it to play games, but everything was there to make them. And not only that, it actually booted into the basic interpreter by default. You had to do something else to play a game. So like, here was a tool that like not only encouraged you to make games, it was like the thing that like was there by default. And that kind of started me off and how I thought about frameworks and developing software. And when thinking back at it, like, I think because it was so accessible, like the ecosystem of games that it created was huge. Like in Russia, like when I was growing up, I didn't buy any games because there was no no Western software was sold there legally, so people just copied them, and you bought these tapes for like, I don't know, 10 cents or something, whatever the equivalent is, and it had all these games in it, and it was amazing. Like there would be, I had friends with like boxes full of tapes of just like hundreds of thousands of games, and they were all created by people, just in this basic interpreter. I'm sure there are other tools, but most of what they did was kind of use this tool to create games. And so this kind of accessibility is what informed a lot of how I thought about making software. And the one other thing that it kind of added also was this idea that I started thinking of software as a thing that was supposed to be free. Like in Russia, like you thought of hardware, right? Like it costs money to make, but software was always like either free or so cheap that like you didn't really thought that was something that people tried to sell. And like even later when I started playing PC games, you would buy this CDs that had like 200 games on them and it would cost like 10 cents or something. In Russia, there was actually stores where you would go in and all the games and software that was sold there were these kind of cheap collections of hundreds of games or programs for like $1. And like legally, they had to have one legal piece of software. So it would be like the official Microsoft Word for like $600, which was like someone's salary for like 2 years. And then like everything else was like a few cents. Anyway, so that got me kind of started with open source software, strangely enough, because it's like, I never thought of paying for software, like Photoshop and all that stuff. Starting out, it was all free. And then when I came to the States and, people were like buying this stuff. And I was like, wow, you're like, paying $800 for Photoshop? That's crazy, Like I never thought of doing that. So I got really into open source software because I thought that like software was supposed to be free, and that seemed like the more obvious choice. And so anyway, going back to the Spectrum, I think that because of this kind of ecosystem of indie games, and because the tools were free and accessible, it created a huge amount of really, really interesting games. Because people, for the most part, not only in Russia, in the UK also, made games not to sell. They made them for fun, because like this was half of how you use the computer was making games, not just playing them. And people made them and made thousands of them. And it, to me, like that seemed like such a great way of making games. And that's what I kind of like got me into the indie game industry originally. I was like, oh, here are people who want to make games, because they want to make games, not to sell them. And it's, I think the indie game industry kind of has been moving towards becoming more commercialized, and tools like Unity, I think are helping in a bad way for it to get there. Like if you look at Unity, right? Like it's free, it's a free tool, but it's not really free. Like it costs $1,500, and like all these other add-ons cost a lot of money. Like it's free only because like the starter edition is free. And if you look at it, like to justify that cost, like the kind of games that are made in Unity are like a very specific kind of games. Like this is just a screenshot of the featured games on the Unity page. There's like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 guns here, I think, and there's like a few swords. And this is just like a screenshot of a really long list. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these games, they have to, like, because Unity is a commercial tool, it kind of encourages you to make commercial games. And I think that's hugely problematic. And I'll talk about why Unity is problematic also later. But this is kind of the first reason. I think that open source and accessible tools are really, really important to game development. And I'm going to, like, if this is for comparison, this is a screenshot of the featured project on the processing website. And you can see the difference between the two. A lot of guns here, and swords, and cars, and these are really interesting, abstract-looking projects. And you know, Unity and processing are different tools, but their technical core is kind of very much the same. It's just how they approach it is very different. Processing kind of targets people who are artists and want to do kind of, and you know, processing is used for commercial purposes also, but it's not kind of like its primary, because it's not a product. Its primary goal is to just be a good, useful tool for artists. And I think that's really important. So I'm going to start a list of like what good tools should be. And the first one would be free and open source. So that's like the first one. So moving on back to a basic. Whoops. This is like a simple program in the ZX Spectrum Basic. I got this off of Google Image Search also. But apparently it prints heart is cool and flashes the border infinitely and beeps really loudly. But this is like a really simple, understandable program. And this is how I started programming. Like as a 10-year-old, like this stuff was really accessible. And you could write like pretty complex things, even if you didn't really understand how things work. And so this is where I started. And then after that, I got a PC, and I moved on to Visual Basic. And so, you ready for this? This is Visual Basic. And it's the same language, really, but like here was a tool to, I don't even know what any of this is, and I used it for like 3 years. It's totally insane. I don't know who designed it or what any of this does, but like it was totally impossible to figure out. And so after Visual Basic, I very quickly switched to C++, which at that time in the late 90s wasn't much better. This is a screenshot of a really ancient tutorial on Direct Draw on how to display an image on the screen. And this is just a part of a really, really, like this is how you clear the screen. And there was like barely any documentation at all for how to do it. Like you had to kind of figure this stuff out. And it's crazy, right? Like now we have all these tools, right? We have Unity, we have all this stuff where you just drag an image and it's there. But like this is what you had to do. And this is just like a fraction of what the actual thing was. And so after this, I kind of stopped programming. I was like, this is insane. Like you know, who wants to write like pages and pages of this arcane crap just to like get an image on the screen? And I stopped. I started doing web programming and doing like some Flash stuff, and I kind of stopped trying. I like learned some OpenGL on the side, but I never really got into it. And then processing came out, and processing, I don't know if everyone's familiar with it or not. If you're not, you should check it out. It's still, I think, kind of the best thing in the world, and it's hugely inspired everything that I've done since then. It's basically a Java-based language that when you download it, it's just a little app. When you launch it, it's just a text editor with a big play button. And you write code that's really, really simple. It just wraps around Java, and then you hit play, and it pops up. And it comes with like examples and tutorials. And the point is that like even though I've been programming for like 10 years up to this point, it made me rediscover programming as a creative discipline, because here was something that I didn't have to worry about, like how to spend 2 hours clearing the screen. I can just use these very basic like commands and make really complex stuff. And processing was a simple tool that went really, really far. Like since it was based on Java, you could basically, it had kind of no ceiling. Like you could go and you can actually, after you like got done with the basic processing language, you could use it as a library in Eclipse and build on top of it and do like really complex stuff. And to me, that is the second like important point about good tools. It's stuff that's accessible, but also like can be used for professional development. And Unity is also a good example of like something on the other end where it's really accessible, but with Unity, you hit a ceiling pretty quickly. Like it's really good for what it is. You can make 3D games in it that are very kind of specific. And then if you want to make something else, it becomes very difficult. So I'm going to add this to, that's the second point of my, how good tools should be. It should be easily accessible and simple, but deep enough for professional use. And then I'm going to add a third point, which doesn't have any fancy slides, but they should be cross-platform. And I was actually talking to Andy about this earlier. But to me, like that it seems crazy to me that people would want to make stuff that's not cross-platform. Like people who, it's not even about like people who, like the two Linux nerds that are not going to play your game if you don't, make Linux versions. But it's just, to me, it's about putting all your eggs into one basket. And it's like, if I'm going to spend years kind of learning a system or learning a framework or a tool, like I don't want it to be limited to, like if I decide to use that I like Macs, in a few years, and I'm using XNA, like, you're screwed because you can't use XNA on a Mac. And if Microsoft decides that XNA is not a thing anymore, like that's it, your tools are gone. So like I think cross-platform, free and open source and accessible tools have been the three kind of pillars in which I've kind of like based my software design. And so with all of that, I decided to make my own framework. And it started, wait, there's a very slow and dramatic logo reveal. This is my framework called Polycode. It started about like 5 or 6 years ago as kind of a collection of tools that after I started using processing and Flash, I kind of realized like there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do this stuff as simply in C++. Like C++ is not like it's a more complex language than Java, but like Java is a pretty complex language. And if you look at like corporate Java code, like it's really obtuse, but like here was like processing, right? This is also Java, and it looks really simple and it's really to understand. So I kind of, after playing with processing for a couple of years, I was like, why can't C++ be this accessible? And so I decided to try making my own kind of C++ framework that used a lot of the conventions from processing and from Flash. And so, sorry. Oh, I have to wait for the logo to come back up. And so I started writing games. And I started putting all this code into, oh, Christ, sorry, I don't need to keep flashing this. I started writing games, and I started putting all the code that I was using for them into one library. And I'll just go through kind of some of the stuff that I've been writing for the past 5 or 6 years, and it should inform what the framework is. So this is like some early prototypes that I was working on. That was 3D. Sorry, these are all just like early shader tests. They're not very interesting, but just gives you an idea. This is a platformer that I was working on with Mr. Adam Saltzman, if you're familiar. This was a 3D first-person game that I made for a competition. This is like more shader tests, just to give you some idea. This is like a little roguelike. This is a project that I did that basically it's called Pastiche. It downloaded. It was before Twitter, so it shows you how old this code is. It downloaded. It parsed blogs and kind of downloaded different keywords that people were saying about different neighborhoods in New York, and then put them into this like typographical 3D map. So this was Space Cruiser. This was a game I did with Babycastles last year at the Hayden Planetarium. It was a game that ran inside the Hayden Planetarium, and it ran networked off of 6 projectors. I can talk about that later. This is another. I was going to say this is another screenshot. It was really hard to kind of take photos of it because it was really dark, but you get an idea. This was a. So I also, I make games in my own time, but for money, I kind of make interactive stuff for ad agencies, and this was an example of like a touchscreen I did for Nike that visualized people running from Nike Plus data. And this is another project. Well, this was a project that we did earlier this year with Keita Takahashi for another Babycastles exhibition. So I used Polycode to build a game that ran across 20 screens around. There's also no like good photos of it, but here's Kunal frantically running through a cave to the next screen. But you had to run from screen to screen. It was like a side scroller. Anyway, so here's another project that I did for, this was at the US Open, and this is a project for IBM that visualized a bunch of real-time data from the US Open across 5 screens on this big touch screen. And this was also running all networked. It had to sync graphics between the 5 screens. It was really a pain in the ass to do. Anyway, so I made all these projects, and I've kind of been like saving the code for them in this one toolkit. And it was all C++, and I really wanted to people to use it. And I released it a year and a half ago. And people really wanted to use it, but I guess not a lot of people are super excited about setting up C++ libraries and messing up with that. But there was also another part to Polycode, which I've been playing around for the past few years, and which is Lua bindings. And I started doing this actually a long time ago when I first discovered Lua. If you're not familiar with Lua, it's an interpreted scripting language that's really, really fast. It's actually one of the fastest like there's Lua and there's Lua GIT, which is what Polycode uses, which is a compiled GIT version of Lua, which is it's probably one, if not the fastest, one of the fastest scripting languages out there. It's almost as fast as compiled languages like C and C++. And so I started playing around with this a few years ago of binding Lua to Polycode, to the C++ API, and kind of like, and this was actually before Unity came out. But I kind of had this idea of like, oh, it'd be great to make this IDE where you can just like write this simple scripting language and kind of like have simple editors, and then you could export it to all kinds of platforms without having to compile anything. And so I went through a bunch of iterations of this. I made actually the IDE 3 times. At first I made it in Cocoa, and then I was like, well, if I want to make it cross-platform, I can't really do it in Cocoa. I'll have to use something else. So I rewrote it in HTML. And like, then I realized that HTML is a horrible, horrible tool for developing any kind of like UI stuff. And so now, this is what it is now. I decided to write Polycode in Polycode, and I wrote a UI toolkit just for that. That became part of Polycode. So actually, all of these kind of controls are part of the API, and you can use them when you use Polycode. And so I guess, let me just show it to you. Easier. How does this work? Final Cut, what? Sorry. So this is Polycode. You launch it, and it's an app. It doesn't fit on the screen, apparently, because it's really huge. I have a really high-resolution screen, so I guess. But hopefully you won't be using it on a really low-res projector. So it's a standalone app. It's kind of like Unity, and you download it. And you just open one of the example projects for like a basic image. It has a text editor. And this is what the code for Polycode looks like. It's very, very simple. And this is Lua, but this is basically a copy. So the Lua bindings are parsed directly from the C++ code, and it creates basically a Lua copy of what the C++ API is. And in C++, it's basically the same code. So to get an image on the screen, it's 3 lines, both in Lua and in C++. Except in C++, you have to do maybe a couple of other things to set up the window. But this is basically what like the philosophy of Polycode has been, is to kind of do as much as possible with as little and as simple as possible a code base, and then build on that to make it really complex on the bottom. So you can like this you can just hit play and it shows you the image. And then you can this is just a really simple 2D example, but you can do pretty advanced stuff. So here's like an advanced lighting example. This is the code for it. And here it's real-time shadows, full dynamic lighting. And so let me just see if I can find a more complex example. So one of the projects that I showed earlier was actually written in Lua. It's called BitWorld. And this is all written like you can open and edit all of this stuff in the IDE. Play. Oh wait, sorry. It has to be and yeah, you can click on the project and you can edit the project settings, the main entry point file, like the width and height, the default video options, the background color, and project modules. So modules in Polycode. So basically, the way this works, there's a core kind of Polycode library that has most of this stuff in it that there's Lua bindings to. But then there's also modules, which is basically any arbitrary code that is compiled into a dynamic library, and then Lua bindings are created from it. So like this physics2D is basically box2D wrapped in Polycode specific code that's compiled into a library, and then there's Lua wrappers around it. And so when you basically build a Polycode program, it builds a polyapp file, which is basically it's like a SWF or a jar file. It puts all the code and all the assets into one file. It's actually probably the same thing that Unity does. And so when you run it through a player. Oh, crap, what is happening? Sorry, things are a little buggy. Okay, so this is a Polycode project. But I was hoping the screen would be larger. Anyway, just to give you an idea. So the Polycode IDE actually has a console that is connected directly to the running code. It uses a network-based debugger. So you can actually send commands directly to execute commands directly in the code base. So it can make the player jump with code. And this is really useful for debugging, and actually is why this is probably a better idea than C++, because you can do stuff like that in C++. And also there's a full, since it's a network debugger, like if you make an error somewhere, let's hope this works. If I make, oh, crap. Sorry, things are a little buggy right now. Whoops. Sorry. Anyway, if I'll choose this one. Like if I make an error and try to run it, it will crash back and tell me exactly the line. Anyway, basic debugger stuff, but it's pretty cool if you write it from scratch. Anyway, so my kind of goal with this is to make a tool that's very much like Unity. Because I think Unity is great. I think Unity is a great tool. It's really useful. But I find it hugely problematic because it's a commercial software. And I think it's problematic to me that it's becoming kind of a de facto standard in indie game development because that it's used in schools and it's used by a lot of people I know. And I understand why it's a great tool. It gets stuff done when you want it. But I think it's a problem when a proprietary kind of commercial software becomes the basic fabric of like the go-to tool that everyone uses. And my goal is to make something that's like it, but that's free and open source. And this is Polycode. And so this IDE, I wasn't starting out to do it. I wanted to just make a good C++ framework, but it seemed that people really, really wanted to use these Lua bindings. So I decided to put it together into a little IDE. Anyway, so sorry, this is it. This is. Okay.
Let's take a little bit. So thanks a lot. Where do I even start? So how long did you work on this? So you said you started working on this 6 years ago?
Yeah, well, if I think of kind of the first code that I started putting together into like a separate code base, it was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And then it didn't really congeal into like a thing until maybe like 3 or 4 years ago when I started doing the Lua bindings, and I really started caring a lot about what it was as like a standalone project.
And when do you think it's ever going to be done?
Probably not. I assigned it an arbitrary version number when I released it a year and a half ago, which was 0.82. I have no idea where I came out with that. It just seemed like a pretty good number because it was close to 1.
I always wonder where these numbers come from.
I don't know. Like, do people actually start out at 0.0 and then just go increment? I don't know. I picked 0.82 because it seemed like close enough to 1 that I'll be able to get there someday, but far away enough that I could like increment by 0.0001 like for a few years and like not really.
Where are you right now?
I haven't incremented the version of it. The development kind of moved to GitHub, and people who use it just use the head version. But so that was kind of my thought with the IDEs. I wanted to kind of get away from this idea of kind of slowly incrementing the C++ part of it and make it like a thing that people can download and put an auto updater in it so they can use it as like an IDE, as like a Unity type thing. And it'll just download the new version when there's a new version, so I don't have to worry about like people.
So the thing that interests me a lot is how do you, when you design a framework like this, how do you even, when you're working on various projects, how do you even figure out what the generalizable part is? Right? Because my assumption is always you would do this because you feel that you've finally realized that to hit a nail into the wall, maybe it would be a good thing to have a hammer with you all the time.
Right.
And not make a new hammer every time. So how do you find, what's the hammer?
I think it's kind of natural for most, I don't know. I come to assume that for most developers, it's kind of natural to put aside boilerplate code that you reuse later. And for me, that's how it started. Like I had I just thought, I'm not gonna, it started, I think, as just image loading code. And I was like, I don't want to have to rewrite this PNG loader like 10 times. So I just put it in the side.
Was this pre-libpng?
No, it uses libpng. I know, I'm not that crazy. I'm not like writing everything from scratch. No, Polycode uses a lot of open source libraries, and without them, there's no way I could have.
zlib, libpng.
Yeah, it's interesting when I was here at the last talk, Kevin's talk, and he talked about him being a programmer that puts stuff together rather than like invent stuff. Like I still think of myself as that like person who takes stuff other people.
I've never seen an IDE that looks as designed as that. Like, what's that typeface? It looks more like it's done for print than it is for programmers.
Right.
It's almost like you appreciate people's aesthetics, like and their sensibilities of what they'd like to work with.
Well, I think it's really important. Like I think, when I first started using Xcode, I kind of realized that a lot of people really hate Xcode, but I think it's really great. Like after using I started with doing Windows programming and using Visual Studio for a long time. And Visual Studio is kind of like that Visual Basic screenshot. It's like this mess of menus and stuff. And then Xcode was it was very similar to I'd say processing. It had a big play button. It was really nicely laid out. And I think it's really I think just because they're technical tools, they shouldn't be ugly.
Well, they're usually made by engineers with, I'll stop right there. I'm not going to diss engineers again. I do that too much these days. So you obviously have large issues with commercial endeavors. Right?
Yeah, I think it's what I always try to get away from. So for me, it's like a personal thing. I have no problem with people, if they want to make games to sell games, I think it's fine. With stuff like Unity, I see a lot of people wanting to using Unity for a really interesting project, but they struggle with the tool itself, which is design. If you UDK is a more extreme version of that, right? It's a tool designed for first-person shooters, and you can do other stuff with it, and people have done really great stuff. But it's something that's designed for a thing with a gun, and it's most of the games that come out with it are that. It doesn't mean that you can't do something good with it, but it's the ecosystem in which you develop is set up for these kind of projects. And it's the same with Unity. It's you can do cool stuff with it, and people do. There's amazing projects done in Unity. but you still kind of exist within this commercial ecosystem of like, you know.
Well, the thing I was trying to get to is I don't even know if it's because it's commercial. Like, for example, you could, I'm just putting this out there, you could have an open source version of Polycode that you still license.
Sure.
Right? There's nothing, or you, because you seem to be insinuating that it has to be free.
No, it's not, that's not, I think to me more it's about the environment in which people kind of function when they develop stuff. So like my problem with Unity is that like, it's not, it's designed as a tool. Like like they put a lot of thought into how you can sell the stuff on iOS, and like they have their own distribution system now. Like the whole thing is designed for like making and selling games, and it's a great tool for that. And I think it's wonderful. But if you're trying to do other stuff, like I feel like you have to just always consciously try not to be a part of that. Like you're always like, oh, maybe everyone else is like making shooters and selling them. Maybe I should make a shooter and sell it. Maybe it's just my personal problem.
No, I think that's perfectly fine. It's just that, like, I just wanted to understand the distinction. Basically,
I don't
there's nothing wrong with licensing. It's just that you shouldn't be making it under. It shouldn't be a design consideration for the framework.
Yeah, but I think like the free and open source part plays a role in it. Like processing is a good example, right? You could make commercial games in processing, like nobody does, because it's not set up for it. It's not what most people who use it do.
But processing was also developed in an academic environment.
It was, yeah.
Right, where there's a person who gives you money.
Right.
Sure. All of you.
Right.
All of us, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, but now you're doing this on your own time, and essentially the way you make this a viable enterprise is by still working on projects that you can do, I assume, much faster, because you're so familiar with your tool.
Right.
So how does that work for you? Like you do these projects like the projection. What's that called? Space Cruiser. Space what? Space Cruiser. The planetarium.
Yeah.
So you do these things and they're commissioned, right?
No, I mean I don't think I got paid anything for that. That was for fun.
You don't think you got paid anything?
I think it was like $500 or something.
Okay.
But no, I did it for fun because it was. I mean, I don't know. If you get a chance to do a game at the Hayden Planetarium,
you get to make a game at the planetarium that's with voiceovers from Stephen Merritt. So
right, yeah,
that's kind of cool. I'd probably do that for free.
Yeah.
Too.
So yeah, I didn't even ask if that was going to cost.
But yeah,
so I think you have to make money somewhere. It's just like, to me, I think it's like in my personal practice, I think it's important for me to separate the commercial end of it from like the creative, and there's nothing wrong with combining them.
Right.
But
I know the other thing that's interesting for me in terms of making your own framework is my impression, and I've never made my own engine, but I do know a lot of people that have made their own engine, is that the people that do write their own engine usually have a knack for coding and programming, and they want to figure that stuff out.
Yeah.
So how much of working on Polycode was out of your desire for design, for having the tool set, and out of the mere fact that you just wanted to learn or teach yourself these technologies?
No, I mean, it definitely started with that. But I think it's important. I mean, I don't know. I think if you make games, I think games are a technical practice. Like, I think it's great that there are tools like Unity that basically let you make games without knowing programming at all. But I think that for the most part, to me, making games is a technical thing. And like, I think tools should be accessible. You should be able to pick something up with knowing nothing about it. But I think you should be ready to learn a lot more and kind of go deeper. And I think like that, like with the stuff that I was writing, I started, knowing nothing at some point, and I just kept going deeper and deeper. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely like my interest in finding that stuff out. And I think some people are more set up for that than others. Like there are people who just want to, make a game, and they don't want to spend days figuring out how to like bind uniforms to shaders and like. But
so at this point, do you use everything in your framework? Is it has the framework like? Do you try to keep it tight so that the parts that are there are actually things that you use, and it's not just like parts that are used once in a project and you just happen to pull them in?
Let me rephrase that. I'm adding less and less stuff to it, and I'm using.
But you haven't done a culling. You've never seen the necessity to say, oh, here's a thing I only use in this one side project. There's no reason for this to be in here.
I took when I first released it, I took out a bunch of stuff and moved it into like outside modules, but then I've been moving that stuff back in just because it's been becoming more popular. I use most of the stuff in the framework, yes. It's just like when I first, and you were asking me earlier about like what like the ceiling is of like where you stop. Like at first when I was adding stuff, like there wasn't like I'm just going to add stuff until I don't need to add stuff anymore. And like now I'm getting to a point where I don't need to add stuff anymore. Like I'm using everything in there, and everything that I need is there. So it's like it's big, you know, it has networking, it has 3D, it has 2D, it has.
So even when you do your own projects with it, you don't find yourself predominantly in the C++ part. You're also
I mostly use C++. Yeah.
Well, so you do not use the scripting. Like you
well,
have
the scripting has been only focused very recently because like it was always this kind of experimental part that I wasn't never sure what to do with, and like then I kind of had this resolve a few months ago to like really concentrate on it, make it into like a tool, into an app that people can use. But it's I'm doing that like I don't know, it's like altruism or something. I don't know, I'm doing it for I'm not doing that for myself. Like I'm okay with C++.
So for these things that use projectors and multiple screens, you clearly need a bunch of different render targets.
Yeah, the Space Cruiser thing it ran on 6 different computers. They were all network, and they basically.
And that networking code is part of the part of Polycode.
Yeah, it uses it's pretty transparent actually. Polycode uses an event system that's like I don't know if anyone's ever used Flash. It's like event handlers and listeners. You just add an event handler and send signals. So the networking stuff plugs right into it. You can add events to.
And it's entirely transparent from the API side.
Yeah, I mean you can get deeper in it. You can send your own.
But you don't have to.
manually.
Like
you don't have to.
It tries to shield you from it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I always wonder, like, because things like I'm not familiar enough with Unity. Can you even do something like that with Unity? Could you do something like the walking side scroller and have 10 different render targets for 10 different screens or 20 different screens?
You probably could. I mean, Unity, like I don't know. I used Unity a couple of times, and like I don't know. I don't want to I don't want to like compare myself to Unity.
Well, I think we talked about this before. I'm with you on that because the few times I used Unity, I felt very constrained. So my background is in graphics programming, so I need to do something as trivial as be able to draw a line.
Yeah.
And then I talked to Scott Anderson, who gave the first Indie Tech talk, and he said, "Oh no, you can't do that." I was like, "Wait, you're telling me that I can't just draw a line?" He's like, "No, you can, but it's not trivial."
Right.
I was like, "Something like setting a pixel or drawing a line should be trivial, otherwise I'm not going to use it." Right. Because I feel that it biases me too heavily towards a specific style. Right. I don't think I'd go as far as your extreme example of shooters, because I've seen maybe that's the tendency. But I've seen really, really interesting stuff done in Unity, but by people who know how to bend it to their will, and I'd rather not have to do that.
But that was kind of my point. Is that it's the bending a tool that's designed for something else into like it's like. You know, it's kind of like when people started using like games for art, right? It was these engines like they were designed almost at that point mostly entirely for shooters, and people were like, "Oh, what else can we do with them?" And there was a lot of interesting stuff that came out with like people just taking tools that were not designed for what they were doing. But I think that's great, but I don't think that should be like the reason why we like should use shooters as our artistic medium.
So I'm going to hand it over to the audience, but so I have one more question that's interesting to me. So every time I start working on a project, I do that thing where I usually start from scratch, or I start from a piece of code that I found on the internet. Like I think, like I helped Eddie on Osmos, and we worked off of a NeHeGL code piece. NeHeGL is a website to learn OpenGL.
That's how I learned OpenGL.
That's how Polycode started. Do you start Polycode off of an NeHeGL demo?
No, I learned NeHeGL stuff way before. I mean, that was like in the 90s.
No, but like the first version of Osmos that was up on Steam had a pop-up box that said full screen ambience, but that was just us changing the text for full screen, because the NeHeGL had like a little pop-up box that would ask for whether you want to run it in full screen or not. And at some point, we had a new.
Oh no, that was like a framework. No, I learned GL on the.
Oh,
on the
we literally took one of the demos that had all kinds of problems because it had no good frame counter and nothing. We had no idea what we were doing. It's amazing how they ever made out the door.
I think starting from scratch is great. It's like a blank sheet, right? Like it's always the most fun. Like I still start projects that are not Polycode based, like in C or something, just because it's nice to just open up a completely blank text file and just write main and just like go for it, and just like I wrote
it's easier. I found it was always easier than writing an engine or a framework, because don't know up front. That's what I meant about how do you know up front what the generalizations are that you need for every project? Right? It's like over-engineering an object-oriented piece of software. Like, so for me, that was always like, let's just do it first. And then when I worked with Eddie, it was impossible to convince him otherwise because he just used arrays everywhere and globals. He didn't care. Like, he didn't want object-oriented programs. He was like, no, don't make me go through your stupid polymorphism, whatever. Right? He's like, I don't know what that is at runtime. I'm like, that's the whole point. But he was like, yeah, but why would you? So it took a while to convince him that would be a good thing. I think it was like more of like a John Carmack thing. I think he also took forever to embrace the idea of working with object-oriented programming because he just used function pointers. He had objects in his code, but they were just like member functions were just function pointers. I'm sure you've looked at the Quake source code itself.
Yeah, it's hugely inspiring.
It's insane.
It is insane.
It's not commented at all. I think there are 2 comments in it.
There's a few.
You need to look at this again. And like,
no, it's beautiful. Quake 2 source code is like one of the most inspiring pieces of software, and I think it inspired me in many ways because it was really bad code, but you could see that the person who wrote it was like a genius. So it was really like,
he wasn't sharing it with anyone.
Right.
Essentially, I think he was working on it on his own, so he didn't have to worry about variable naming and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to write good code and kind of go crazy. I don't comment my code at all. There's not a single comment on the entire Polycode.
So you write the code in such a way that you just know?
I think it helps by not commenting code. It makes you write more readable code. Nice. I think I'd rather see code that's not commented but written in like English than having some cryptic thing with like a paragraph explaining it. Like, I think code should kind of explain itself.
Okay, so in closing of my part, when do we get to get our hands on that? Because you just mentioned me a while ago, you took the link down. Right?
Yeah, I took down the site just because everything on there is a year and a half old, and I'm hopefully will release. It says it's going to be released on December 1st, and hopefully I'll be able to do that. But
are you going to put more effort into advertising it at that point?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be like the bigger release. I mean, I want people to start using it. I want people to start helping develop it because I'm definitely not going to be able to like compete with Unity by myself. But I do want people to like contribute.
Very cool. I'm very much looking forward to that. Okay, so with that, let's go to the audience part. Please, questions.
It sounds like it'd be a really cool framework to be used in the university. Teaching intro programming course. Our students know C++. I think on December 1st would be released to integrate into the course.
I think it's going to be pretty buggy, to be honest, when it comes out. So like, I think teaching programming with something that might be buggy is problematic because then you'll have to explain to your students why.
You could teach it.
Yeah.
Well, that would be terrific.
Should get him to teach the.
Would you like to teach a course?
Yeah, we should get Ivan to teach the engine programming course.
No, I mean, I definitely think that like stuff that's taught in school should be based on open source code. That was part of why I think Unity, and like when I see Unity being taught in schools, I don't know.
Right now we're using XNA and C# and then open source alternatives.
Yeah. No, I mean like XNA and Unity and all that stuff is great. Like it lets you do stuff really quickly, and that's great. Like I have nothing against it. But I think kind of in the long term there are issues with it. Hey.
We have a microphone if you guys want to pass around.
Hey.
So I just wanted to ask, because you were kind of talking about, the commercial versus the indie, and then Andy introduced this issue of like, well, if you're looking at processing, that's something that's developed in an academic environment. I'm kind of wondering, I know that you have a lot of different intellectual interests as an artist and as like a, programmer in a lot of different ways, and I kind of wonder why, what you think about integrating kind of what you're interested in into an academic environment, and why you haven't gone that direction already, and like what appeals to you about that and doesn't, and why you put your sort of business in the commercial world instead of in the academic world.
Right. Well, I hear you don't make a lot of money in the academia, but
you haven't tried it yet.
I don't know. I when I first started, like when I first started programming, like, when I was growing up playing games and like, kind of checking stuff out and figuring out what I wanted to do, I always thought that like what I wanted to do for money was what I wanted to do for like what my interests were. And when I first started doing that, like I was like, oh, I'll make games, I'll sell them, it's going to be great. And then like as I started kind of working as a professional programmer, I started to realize that like the more it was really burning me out, kind of creatively doing this stuff for money, because you do work a lot of hours, when you do stuff professionally. And at some point, I realized that it might be a better idea to just keep the two completely separate and just try to make a lot of money doing other stuff that will let you do your own things. Like you need to make money one way or another. Like it doesn't matter what you make, and it's true. Like when in the academia, like there's always someone like sponsoring it in one way or another. And with open source software, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I think it's important to figure out a way to like make money and then like to me do your own stuff on the side. And then
Can you pass the microphone back?
Okay, good. Yeah, I was really curious. What was the biggest technical challenge you had when writing this? Like, was it the bindings or the 3D, the shading? What was the hardest part of this?
The bindings were definitely the hardest part to figure out because I don't know if anyone's familiar in like binding a scripting language to C++. It's never pretty. Like for Lua, there's a bunch of third-party tools that let you basically bind. So the way that works, so Lua can't bind to C++ directly. It can only execute pure C functions. So you have to write wrappers for C++ in C and then write Lua wrappers around that. And on top of that, Lua doesn't actually have an object-oriented class system, but it's flexible enough that you can write your own class system in it. So I basically wrote this giant, it's kind of to me, it's my favorite part of Polycode. It's one Python file that parses the entire C++ code base and then generates C wrappers around that, generates Lua classes around those wrappers, and then generates documentation on top of that. So it created, like I ended up
created an auto binder.
An auto binder.
Like there's just
and there is stuff that out there. It's just like it never worked the way that I wanted it to work. Like it added a lot of crap that made it slow.
And your auto binder also takes care of data types and passing in values and parsing them. And
right. There's no Lua is not a typed language, but it does.
So you have to do the interpretation on the C side.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as that. Okay. I can talk to you about that if anyone's interested in like the nitty-gritty details of it.
Sorry.
So I have two questions. One, would you consider doing Python bindings, since you seem to be familiar with Python?
Python was my original, like before I actually knew about Lua, Python. I actually had, before Polycode, I wrote a very simple kind of 2D platformer framework, and I made Python bindings to that. I love Python. It's my favorite language. I think it's amazing. The problem with Python is that it's really hard to embed. If you, like Lua is, you can compile Lua into a tiny static library and just add it to your code, and it's like extra 400K, and it's all part of the executable. With Python, you have to bundle this giant distribution.
About 4 megs when you do it with Python. I've done it. It's very, it is difficult.
And it's like all these weird tools to package it all into an executable.
And it doesn't work. It's not very cross-platform. You have to use different things for different.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
So I would love to. Like, I love Python, but there just didn't seem to be a good way to actually.
I mean, from what you described, it sounds like. I guess I should ask my next question first. Are you familiar with like Alan Kay and his talks on sort of interactive development and his feelings on the roots of object-oriented programming?
No.
So what you were talking about very early on in your talk, I have a similar background where I learned BASIC when I was 7 on an Apple II, and I hire programmers now. And what strikes me is I think people who don't have that interactive background become very dogmatic, and they have sort of like a lot of times, like when you're developing something, you really want an interactive environment. You know, the Unix shell is interactive, BASIC is interactive. You know, the power of Python. I use IPython a lot because it's so powerful interactively. JavaScript is interactive. There's a lot of it lightens the cognitive load of the developer to be working in an interactive environment, and there's a lot of research, academic research about that, really. So I mean, I think your project is very well suited to that. And if you use like something like PyPy instead of a Lua C++ combination, like I think that would, again, from a sort of like research academic standpoint, like you would be closer to fulfilling the goal of like a full stack that can be understood. Because I think that's something that any IDE, I'm trying to write my own IDE actually, coincidentally, and I think all IDEs suffer from inspection problems, which is a fundamental problem in computer science, right? Like, can you inspect the IDE to modify the IDE? Like, what is Visual Studio written in C#? Like, I don't think it is actually. And so I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea of what you have, and I think that there's like, it's really impressive. It's really a good job. It's cool.
Thanks. Yeah, my kind of thought, like the design process with the idea was to make like a shell that like can handle different editors, and it actually has like C++ based handlers for different file types. But my eventual goal is to make it so you can just have a Lua editor, and you can just have someone write like a simple Lua editor that handles the file type, so you can basically have it be a universal editor for most types. Because most of the times when you're making a game or something, you have your own assets that are non-standard, and you want to edit for like, I don't know, characters or levels or something like that. And like it would be nice to have a system where people can just write parts of the ID right inside of the ID. And like I think eventually I would like to explore that.
So Smalltalk works that way actually. Smalltalk is written in Smalltalk and runs in Smalltalk. So.
I know nothing about Smalltalk. That's
Clara?
Hi. So I was actually looking at your website because even though you've changed the homepage, you can still see everything else.
Right.
Google betrayed you. Sorry. And I was wondering, you know, it seems that you want to get other people to work in Polycode and help you expand it. You probably want to start commenting your code for that. But I'm also coming from the academic point of view. Like if I want to use this, when I'm evaluating tools to use in a class, the biggest factor for me is not only that they're available to students for free or for very, very cheap, but that there is a community.
Right.
And I see that you do have forums, but how are you planning on appealing to communities and grow the community of support, not only to grow the tool itself, but the people who are going to use it and ask questions and ask for features and that, like, do you have a plan for that, or do you have like a set of strategies, or you want me, do you want us to help you like set up that community?
I've been kind of like as Andy mentioned, I've been personally trying not to advertise Polycode that much, just because when it first, I kind of wanted to release it before, like while it was still really buggy, just so that like people can get their hands on it and start playing with it. And I didn't want to be like, oh, I made this thing, everyone come use it, because it did have a lot of problems. It's funny when you use your own framework, like you get used to things and you're okay with things being buggy, you just know how to work around that, and you just kind of forget that they're there. But then other people look at it and they're like, this is completely broken. So that's why I kind of like, there are a few people who started using it regularly, and they kind of, one of them has become like a constant contributor of code back to Polycode, and it was really nice to have this very small group of people so that I didn't have to like kind of explain to a lot of people why things are broken, and I've kind of kept it that way. But yeah, definitely when I release it, I mean, any project I think depends on the community around it, and I think like Flixel is a great example of that. Like Flixel has a huge community of users, and it's really easy to get started just because there's like hundreds of people who are like willing to help you out. But yeah, definitely, and you're right, I think.
Mike?
So you don't like FPSs?
I like FPSs.
You just think there's too many, like it's oversaturated?
I know for a fact that you just watched the entirety of Halo 4 on YouTube.
Halo Reach.
Oh, Halo Reach.
But I didn't watch the first version. I just watched the cutscenes, not the first version.
Because I actually have an idea for the money situation. If you want to see less FPSs come out of Polycode, any economist will tell you that if you want to decrease something, you should tax it. So you could go like FPSs have to pay you 20% revenue, and then racing games pay 10%, a little more acceptable. But generally, I think it's very interesting that you're showing you're talking about processing as like your example, because to me, like I'm totally a Unity guy, and I want to use Unity for my next game, and I really like it, and I want to make an FPS game. You know, it's like not because, and I don't want to make Halo 4. I want to make something original and unique, but I want to make it within that constraint just because it's really popular right now, and then totally thinking about it in a commercial way. And I look at processing as like this thing that art dudes use to make weird projects that I don't care about and don't have any relevance to me. And I'm like interested to hear what your perspective is. Would you like, and I assume that you don't want to have any controls on what people make with your tool because you're very altruistic about it, but do you have like an idea of what you want to see come out of it? Like what kind of stuff you want to see people do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I like FPS. I actually was talking to Charlie today about how I want to make an FPS. No, I think there's nothing wrong with FPSs. There's nothing wrong with commercial games. I still play Counter-Strike. You know, it's not. I just think that as far as tools, I don't think that they should be that specific. And like my problem with Unity is not necessarily what comes out of it, is that what's not coming out of it. So it's like I want to see new stuff, and I don't know what that is. You know what I mean? So like I've never called Polycode a game engine because of that. I always called it like a creative code frame. I don't actually have a good marketing name for it. I don't know. I'm still struggling with what to call it, but I don't want to call it a game engine. And like I think like Unity calls itself a game engine, but like you can do so much more with it. But I think like if someone wants to pick a tool to do like some interactive installation, and they look at Unity and it's a game engine, and there's a guy with a machine gun on the first page, you know, they're going to be like, maybe this is not the best tool for me. So I think that's a problem that's really easy to fix. Is just don't put a guy with a machine gun on your front page. Like that's.
But like anytime you make a tool, you kind of specify what is available to people because you didn't make everything that can possibly be made for graphics programming. You went down a road that you thought was the right road, and someone else like I don't know. I think about games that come out of Unreal Engine back like 3 years ago or whatever. Every single one had the exact same shine. And it all looked exactly the same. And like I think about that because I'm not smart with graphics programming. I'm struggling to figure out shaders right now, and it's like I don't know how to do this shit, and I'm bad at it. And so I'm always going to be depending on someone else's solution. And it's always going to look like something that somebody else did before. And so I'm not going to be able to do something totally unique and out there. And that's what I hate about being dependent on other people's tools.
But I think that's because you want to make something that's so complex that you don't understand how to make it. Like you can make a first-person game that doesn't use shaders. You can make a first-person game that's very simple. That's like wireframe, and still make something really interesting and compelling. You know, like I think that's part of the kind of issue with Unity, right? Is that it because it's a commercial tool to make modern games. Like that's what it wants you to make when you start up Unity. Like I think when I first downloaded Unity, like I think when it opens you up into a first-person shooter. That was the template that it opened.
my version opened me up into the island demo.
Right. Yeah.
But it wasn't a gun there. It was just
I think
there's a strong association with seeing a first-person perspective and expecting a gun there.
Right, but
I think
on that island there were like first-person shooter assets. Like I felt like that's what it wanted me to like. Even if that wasn't their intention, like that's what I got from it. And look, I think it's fine. Like I play first-person shooters. Like I have fun doing it. I think it's great. I just like I said, as far as tools,
you're bugged by the monoculture, which a lot of us are. I mean, like you'd like to see more diversity.
Yeah.
Michael do that. Michael take care of the diversity.
I think that's more that the audience is shitty than the developers are shitty. I think there's a lot of creativity out there, but I think commercial stuff, the audience, the mass audience that we're trying to make money off of, they like first-person shooters. I mean, they like the exact same shit fed to them. Otherwise, we wouldn't be getting the 8th Halo game and the 13th Call of Duty game. I mean, that's just, and you can get away from that by doing the World of Goo thing and just like make something totally out there and unique and amazing, and then find a small audience that'll pay for that. But
I mean, if you want to make money, then you're right. But if
Yeah, I really do.
no, it's not a judgment of what you want to do. I just think that like if you want to talk about diversifying like what games are and what they can be, like that's problematic thinking, you know. Like, but you know, different people do it for different reasons, and
Mike's burnt by making games that are really quirky and cool and not making any money off of it.
no, it's totally fine.
Mike made Solid Skier, just in case people.
No, and that was
which
great.
that did great, right. and that wasn't a first-person shooter. So, any more questions? No more questions. Here we go. One more.
Sure. Just how do you foresee, I guess, Polycode expanding, I guess, the modules people want to target specific platforms? Is that how you?
Yeah. So right now you can export from Polycode directly to Mac, Linux, and Windows, but it basically does the same thing as Unity does. It copies a prepackaged player with the thing that you made. The next kind of goal is to make it export to iOS and stuff like that, but it hasn't been a huge priority just because I hate iOS as like a platform, and but I'm hoping that will get big enough that there are people who are super excited about it and will kind of help. Yeah, it's interesting to see how like, because like Unity, for example, like they made iOS like a huge part of what it is because like that's what everyone wanted to make games for, because it was like where you could not necessarily even make money, but you have the biggest reach to an audience. Like iOS was like the thing. Like Unity kind of coincided, like the release of like Unity to the public kind of coincided with iOS becoming a big platform, and they made that like their big push. But like I just don't have an interest in making iOS games, so for me that wasn't a priority. But I would love to see someone kind of.
Okay, so aside of finishing up, wait, do we have more questions? Okay, here, go for it.
Who do you see as your primary audience? Who do you see as your primary audience for Polycode, since it's such a low cost of entry to get into it? Are you hoping that this is going to be used more educationally, or for people that are new to programming, or obviously it also needs the experienced programmers to carry on the open source portion of it. So anyway, who do you see as the audience?
Well, I guess my goal with it is to make it that it, like it's kind of, I want it to be both. I want it to be so that people who don't know anything about programming can pick it up and look at the examples and have it be something like processing, where they can look at something really simple of how to get an image up. And then kind of, since it's the Lua side is basically a mirror image of the C++ side, I see it as like a really good tool for people to start with something really simple and then move into more complex Lua stuff, and then from that move into C++ and kind of like have a tool that you can use from like figuring out how to display an image to making like a fully blown kind of like complex project. So hopefully because I use it mostly for professional development, I use the C++ part mostly, and you know, it's like I write stuff that's like thousands and thousands of lines of code. But like with this IDE, I kind of, even for myself, want to have a tool to easily play around with code, and I want to kind of maintain both sides of it and see where they meet in the middle.
Okay, last question.
How do you think you can maintain the simplicity of the framework when moving from something like processing to Eclipse is a pretty big jump, and it seems like the kind of really nicely designed frameworks do have some, like processing has some ceiling, even though it's pretty broad and can be applied in many cases. You do need to kind of move to more traditional environments to do some stuff. So, and it seems like those environments always they're just so different. So I'm wondering what you think of kind of keeping that kind of level of design and simplicity of something like processing in more complicated frameworks.
Right.
And like why that isn't the case.
Yeah, well, how I just kind of designed the C++ part was in thinking a lot about how to make it really simple to use. Because like, you know, like when you look at, like a lot of it was inspired by Flash, for example, like we had movie clips where you have a movie clip and you add something to the movie clip and it just goes and you don't have to do anything. Like that was kind of like, and a lot of this, even the C++ part of Polycode has very simple syntax like that. And so my hope is that someone can move from like the Lua side to the C++ side and not actually feel like they're moving into a new language. Like the C++ syntax is going to be different, but they're going to be using the same kind of conventions they've been using while they were doing the Lua stuff. And then it's just a matter of figuring out the C++ tools of how to set up an Xcode project and stuff like that, and kind of like the specifics of it. But you can, you know, I was actually thinking, even, you know, it wouldn't even be that hard to make something that takes Lua code and just generates C++ code out of it. Go full circle from, because the syntax is almost completely the same. And then from there, you know, it's C++. It's like an open C. Like they can go wherever they want. I think the ceiling with processing was that it's Java, and you could do, after you move to Eclipse, you could do everything that Java could do, but then that had its own ceiling. So with C and C++, that's about as low as you can go, unless you want to get into assembly stuff.
Okay, so in closing, I'm going to say the side of finishing.
Hey, what is that? What?
somehow putting out a version that we can all get our hands on, and then maybe becoming a famous teacher at NYU in framework design, because you're totally going to get asked to do that. What's next?
I mean,
a game?
Yeah, maybe a first-person shooter.
That's a good closer. I can't top that. Thanks a lot.
I have Polycode installed on that machine, so I can kind of play around with it, and you guys can check it out.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
Go play with stuff, break stuff, tell them how you fix it, and come back for the next one with Cindy Crumbaugh.
Thanks a lot.